The island that keeps disappearing and coming back. There is an island in the South Pacific that does not behave the way islands are supposed to behave. It appears. It grows. It reaches a size large enough to be mapped, named, and argued over by the governments of neighboring nations. And then, over the course of months or years, it shrinks. It erodes. It sinks back beneath the surface of the ocean. And it disappears, completely without trace, leaving nothing but open water where solid ground had been. And then, sometimes, it comes back. This is not mythology. This is not a sailor's exaggeration. This is not a mistaken reading on an old chart. This is a geological phenomenon that has been documented, measured, and studied by scientists for decades. Islands that appear and disappear. Coastlines that advance and retreat. Land that is simultaneously being created and destroyed, on timescales that range from weeks to centuries. And in the 21st century, as sea levels rise and geological forces continue their ancient work, the story of these vanishing islands has taken on a new and urgent dimension. Because it is no longer just a story about geology. It is a story about nations. About sovereignty. About what happens when the land a country is built on disappears into the sea. About the people who live on islands that may not exist by the end of this century. About the laws and treaties and international agreements that were written for a world where land, once it existed, stayed where it was. This is the story of the islands that keep disappearing. And what their fate tells us about our own. To understand why islands appear and disappear, you have to understand the basic geology of how islands form in the first place. There are several ways an island can come into existence. Some islands are continental, fragments of the continental crust that became separated from the main landmass through geological processes over millions of years. Greenland, Madagascar, the British Isles, these are all, in a geological sense, pieces of continent that got left behind. Other islands form through volcanic activity, where a tectonic plate moves over a hot spot in the Earth's mantle, a plume of unusually hot rock rising from deep within the Earth. The heat melts through the plate and creates a volcano on the seafloor. If the volcano grows large enough, it breaks the surface and becomes an island. As the plate continues to move, the volcano moves away from the hot spot, becomes extinct, and begins to erode. Meanwhile, the hot spot creates a new volcano behind it. This is how the Hawaiian Islands formed, a chain of islands of decreasing age, stretching northwest across the Pacific, each one a former volcano that has been carried away from the hot spot that created it. But there is a third type of island formation that is particularly relevant to our story. The volcanic island that forms not from a hot spot but from an active volcanic system at a mid-ocean ridge or a subduction zone. These islands can appear dramatically and rapidly. A submarine eruption breaks the surface, a new island emerges from the sea, and they can disappear just as rapidly, eroded by waves and weather before they have had time to consolidate into stable land. These ephemeral islands, geologically young, often composed of loose volcanic material rather than solid rock, subject to the relentless erosion of the ocean, are the ones that appear and disappear on human timescales. Not over millions of years. Not over thousands of years. But over decades. Sometimes over months. The most famous of these ephemeral islands, the one whose repeated appearances and disappearances have been most closely followed, is a small piece of land in the Tyrrhenian Sea, off the coast of Sicily, known variously as Ferdinandia, Graham Island, Julia, and Isle Julia. Its story begins in the summer of 1831. In June of that year, sailors in the Tyrrhenian Sea began reporting strange phenomena. Dead fish floating on the surface. The smell of sulfur. Water that seemed to be boiling in patches. Columns of steam rising from the sea. On July 10, 1831, a British ship reported a large waterspout, a column of water and steam shooting upward from the sea surface. Within days, a small volcanic cone had broken the surface. It grew remarkably fast. Within weeks, it had reached a height of over 60 meters above sea level and a circumference of nearly 5 kilometers. It was solid enough to walk on. It was large enough to be visible from the Sicilian coast. And immediately, the neighboring powers began arguing about who owned it. Britain claimed it, naming it Graham Island after the British First Lord of the Admiralty. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Italian state that controlled Sicily at the time, claimed it, naming it Ferdinandia after their King Ferdinand II. France claimed it, naming it Isle Julia because it had appeared in July. Spain sent a ship and considered its claim. It was, briefly, one of the most contested pieces of real estate on Earth. Strategically positioned in the central Mediterranean. A potential base for naval operations. A coaling station. A prize worth having. And then it sank. By January of 1832, less than 6 months after it appeared, Ferdinandia had eroded below the surface of the sea. The arguments about sovereignty became moot. The island was gone. But not forever. Ferdinandia is a submarine volcanic feature. It sits on an active volcanic system, and it has shown signs of activity multiple times since 1832. In 1863, it nearly broke the surface again. In 2000, scientists monitoring the area detected increased volcanic activity, raising speculation that the island might re-emerge. Italian scuba divers, apparently concerned that if it did reappear it might be claimed by another nation, placed an Italian flag on the underwater peak. The island has not reappeared, yet. But the geological conditions that created it have not changed. Ferdinandia is the most historically colorful example of a vanishing island. But in the 21st century, the phenomenon that is causing islands to vanish has changed. It is no longer primarily geological. It is primarily climatological. Sea level rise, driven by the warming of the Earth's climate through the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, is threatening the existence of low-lying islands around the world. Not the dramatic volcanic islands of the Tyrrhenian Sea that appear and disappear on their own geological timetable, but inhabited islands. Islands that have been home to human communities for hundreds and thousands of years. Islands where people were born, where their parents were buried, where their languages and cultures and traditions developed. These islands are disappearing not because of volcanic activity or geological instability. They are disappearing because the ocean is rising around them. The numbers are stark. The global average sea level has risen by roughly 20 centimeters since 1900. The rate of rise is accelerating. The current rate is approximately 3 to 4 millimeters per year, and it is increasing. Depending on how much greenhouse gas humanity continues to emit, sea level projections for the end of the century range from roughly half a meter of additional rise in the most optimistic scenarios to more than a meter in the more pessimistic ones. Some analyses suggest that under high-emission scenarios, sea level could rise by 2 meters or more by 2100. For a low-lying atoll whose highest point is 2 meters above sea level, the difference between those projections is the difference between a difficult but survivable future and complete inundation. The Maldives is the country that has become the global symbol of this threat. The Maldives is an archipelago nation, a country made up entirely of islands, located in the Indian Ocean, southwest of Sri Lanka. It consists of approximately 1,200 coral islands, grouped in 26 atolls. The total land area of the entire country is less than 300 square kilometers, smaller than many cities. And it is extraordinarily flat. The average elevation of the Maldives above sea level is approximately 1.5 meters. Its highest natural point is less than 3 meters above the sea. There is no high ground. There is no place in the entire country to retreat to if the sea rises. The Maldives has roughly 540,000 citizens. They have a government, a parliament, a judiciary, schools, hospitals, a military, a foreign policy, an Olympic team. They are a fully sovereign nation that has been a member of the United Nations since 1965. And their country may be uninhabitable within this century. The then president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, held a famous cabinet meeting underwater in 2009. Ministers in scuba gear, signing documents on an underwater table, to draw global attention to the threat his country faced. The image went around the world. It was theatrical, but the point it made was genuine and serious. What happens to a country when its land disappears? This is not a theoretical question. It is a question that the Maldives government has been grappling with seriously for decades. They have purchased land in India and Australia as potential sites for relocating their population. They have invested heavily in coastal protection, seawalls, land reclamation, to defend their existing islands. They have been among the most vocal advocates for aggressive climate action at every international forum. And they have begun to ask a question that international law has never had to answer before. If the physical land that a nation is built on disappears beneath the sea, does the nation continue to exist? The question is not academic. International law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea UNCLOS, defines a nation's maritime boundaries based on the location of its coastline. A nation's exclusive economic zone, the area of ocean in which it has the right to exploit resources, extends 200 nautical miles from its baseline, which is essentially its coastline. For island nations, the EEZ is often enormously valuable, far larger than the land territory of the country, and potentially rich in fisheries, mineral deposits, and other resources. The Maldives EEZ covers nearly 1 million square kilometers of ocean. Kiribati's EEZ covers over 3 million square kilometers, making it, in terms of maritime territory, one of the largest nations on Earth, despite having a total land area of less than 1,000 square kilometers. If those islands sink beneath the sea, what happens to the EEZ? Under current international law, the answer is unclear, and potentially devastating for the nations involved. If the land that defines their baseline disappears, their maritime boundaries could contract or disappear with it. The fisheries and mineral resources in their EEZ could become open to exploitation by other nations. Centuries of maritime rights could evaporate along with the islands that established them. There are ongoing efforts in international law to address this. Some legal scholars argue that a nation's maritime boundaries should be frozen, locked in place based on current coastlines, even if those coastlines change due to sea level rise. In 2021, the Pacific Islands Forum adopted a declaration asserting that their maritime zones should remain unchanged regardless of sea level rise. Some individual nations have passed domestic legislation making the same argument. But these declarations have not been tested in international courts. The legal framework for a world where inhabited islands disappear beneath the sea has not been written. We are living in the gap between the world we have and the legal architecture we need. Kiribati is another nation confronting this reality with particular urgency. Kiribati, pronounced Kiribati, is a small Pacific island nation consisting of 33 atolls and reef islands spread across an area of the Pacific Ocean roughly the size of the continental United States. Its total land area is about 800 square kilometers. Its population is approximately 120,000 people. It is, in several respects, extraordinarily vulnerable. Its islands are low-lying, many of them barely above sea level. It sits in a region of the Pacific where sea levels are rising faster than the global average. It is also subject to El Niño events that can cause temporary additional sea level increases, flooding islands that might otherwise remain above water. The president of Kiribati, Anodi Tong, spent much of his presidency, from 2003 to 2016, traveling the world trying to draw attention to his country's situation. He purchased approximately 6,000 acres of land on the Fijian island of Vanuatu as a potential relocation site for his country's population. He became one of the most recognizable faces of climate advocacy. His successor, Taneti Mamau, took a different approach, emphasizing adaptation and resilience, arguing that Kiribati should fight for its survival rather than planning for relocation. The government has invested in land reclamation and coastal protection. The argument between adapt and stay and plan to move, between resilience and relocation, is one that many threatened island nations are having internally, and it is not a simple one. It involves not just the physical question of whether adaptation is possible, but the cultural, psychological, and political question of what it means to leave the place your people have called home for 1,000 years. Tuvalu is perhaps the most poignant case. Tuvalu is a tiny Pacific island nation. 9 atolls, 26 square kilometers of land, approximately 11,000 people. It is the 4th smallest country in the world by land area. Its highest point is 5 meters above sea level. In 2023, Tuvalu became the first country in the world to create a digital nation, a virtual version of itself that would exist even if its physical territory disappeared. The Tuvalu government signed an agreement with Australia that includes a pathway for Tuvaluan citizens to migrate to Australia, effectively creating a situation in which the nation's population might relocate while the government attempts to maintain the country's legal existence through digital means. Tuvalu's Foreign Minister Simon Kofe became famous for a video he recorded standing knee-deep in the ocean, in his suit, speaking to the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in 2021. He did not fly to Glasgow. He recorded the video in Tuvalu in the sea, to make a point about where his country was heading. "We are sinking," he said. "But so is the rest of the world." The image, a government minister, formally dressed, standing in the rising sea, became one of the defining visual documents of the climate crisis. Not all disappearing islands are sinking. Some are being eaten. Coastal erosion, the physical removal of land by wave action, current and storm surge, is accelerating in many parts of the world. The combination of sea level rise, which allows waves to reach further inland, and the increased intensity of storms driven by a warmer climate, is causing coastlines to retreat at rates that would have seemed impossible a century ago. The Louisiana coastline in the United States is one of the most dramatic examples. Louisiana has lost over 4,900 square kilometers of coastal land since the 1930s. That is an area roughly the size of Delaware gone. The rate of loss has sometimes reached an acre every 33 minutes. The causes are complex and partly human-made. The Mississippi River, which once deposited sediment that built up the Louisiana coast, was channeled and levied in ways that reduced that sediment delivery. The oil and gas industry drilled wells across the coastal wetlands, and the extraction of subsurface fluids caused the land to subside. The canals cut for oil and gas pipelines allowed saltwater to intrude into freshwater marshes, killing the marsh vegetation that held the soil together. The result is that the Louisiana coastline is dissolving. Islands that appeared on maps 50 years ago are gone. Communities that have existed for generations are being abandoned. The city of New Orleans, which sits below sea level behind a system of levees, is slowly sinking. This is not happening on a geological timescale. It is happening now, within living memory, on a human timescale that people can observe and experience. In the Arctic, islands are disappearing for yet another reason. Permafrost, ground that remains frozen year-round, is thawing as Arctic temperatures rise at a rate roughly 4 times faster than the global average. And many Arctic islands, particularly in the Russian Arctic and in northern Canada, are composed partly or largely of permafrost. When that permafrost thaws, the ground loses its structural integrity. It slumps. It erodes. It washes into the sea. Muostak Island in Russia's Laptev Sea, once a substantial island large enough to have been used as a reindeer grazing area and a weather observation station, has been losing land at an astonishing rate. Some estimates suggest it has lost more than 100 meters of coastline in a single year. The island is literally dissolving. Similar processes are occurring across the Arctic. Islands that have appeared on charts for centuries are shrinking visibly. Coastlines that have been stable for thousands of years, held in place by the rigidity of frozen ground, are suddenly mobile. For the indigenous communities that have lived in these regions for millennia, communities whose relationship with the land is not just practical but spiritual and cultural, the loss is not measured only in square kilometers. It is measured in the disappearance of places that are embedded in language, in story, in identity. There is an island in the Pacific that represents the strange intersection of all these forces: geological, climatic, legal, human. Hunga Tonga, Hunga Harapai, was a small volcanic island in the Kingdom of Tonga. It had formed through previous volcanic activity, was largely uninhabited, and attracted scientific attention primarily because it was a rare example of a new island that had survived long enough to develop soil and vegetation. On January 15, 2022, the volcano beneath it erupted. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded history. The explosion was heard as far away as Alaska, over 9,000 kilometers. The pressure wave it generated circled the Earth multiple times. The tsunami it triggered reached coastlines across the Pacific and as far as the Atlantic. And the island essentially ceased to exist. The eruption removed most of the land that had been Hunga Tonga, Hunga Harapai. What had been a growing vegetated island, a place that scientists had been watching as an example of how new islands develop, was reduced to a small remnant in hours. It appeared. It grew. It was studied. It exploded. The geological forces that create and destroy islands operate on their own schedule. Climate change accelerates the destruction. Human activity, the channeling of rivers, the drilling of wells, the draining of wetlands, contributes to the loss. The legal frameworks we have built for a stable world struggle to keep up with a world in motion. The islands that are disappearing are not just geographical features on a map. They are homelands. They are the places where languages developed that exist nowhere else on Earth. where fishing techniques were refined over hundreds of generations, where navigation traditions were maintained that allowed people to cross thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars and the swells, where burial grounds hold the ancestors of living communities, where the concept of home is not a choice but a birthright. When an island disappears, it does not just remove land from the map. It removes a place from the world. And with it, it removes something that cannot be relocated, cannot be digitized, cannot be preserved in the memory of a diaspora, the specific irreplaceable relationship between a people and the particular piece of earth they have called home. This is what the rising sea is taking. Not just land. Lives, yes. Livelihoods, certainly. The physical capacity to survive in place, absolutely. But also something harder to quantify. A relationship between people and place that took 1,000 years to develop and that cannot be rebuilt somewhere else, no matter how much land Australia purchases on behalf of the Tuvaluan government. What does the future hold for the world's disappearing islands? The honest answer is, it depends on choices that humanity has not yet made. If greenhouse gas emissions are reduced dramatically and rapidly, if the most ambitious targets of the Paris Agreement are met, sea level rise by the end of the century might be limited to 0.5 meter or so. That is still significant. It will still cause damage, displacement, and loss. But it is a future in which many threatened islands remain habitable, in which adaptation is possible, in which the communities that live there have a fighting chance. If emissions continue on their current trajectory, if the warming that has already been locked in by past emissions is compounded by future emissions, sea level rise could reach 1 meter, or 2 meters, or more by 2100. In that future, many of the low-lying atolls that are home to Pacific island nations are not just threatened. They are gone. The difference between those futures is not geological. It is political. It is the aggregate of decisions made by governments and corporations and individuals. Decisions about energy systems, transportation, agriculture, land use, that will determine how warm the planet gets and how high the sea rises. The islands that are disappearing are not disappearing because of some inevitable geological fate. They are disappearing because of choices. Choices that were made without thinking about their consequences. Choices that are still being made today. And the people who live on those islands, the people of the Maldives and Kiribati and Tuvalu and the dozens of other low-lying communities around the world that face this threat, did not make those choices. They are among the people who have contributed least to the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving sea level rise. Their carbon footprint is a tiny fraction of the global average. They are paying for choices they did not make. That is the injustice at the heart of this story. Not just the loss of land. The loss of land by people who did not cause the loss. The disappearance of homelands belonging to communities that bear no responsibility for the forces that are destroying them. There is a particular image that stays with me. It is not the Tuvaluan foreign minister standing in the sea. It is not the underwater cabinet meeting in the Maldives. It is not the satellite images of Hunga Tonga, Hunga Harapai before and after the eruption. It is something simpler. It is a map of Kiribati from 50 years ago, compared to a satellite image of the same islands today. You can see in the comparison, how some of the smaller islands have changed shape. How some of them have lost land on one side and gained it on another, as the sand moves and the currents shift. How the outline that was fixed on the map is actually fluid, actually in motion, actually alive in a way that maps, which by their nature present the world as stable and static, cannot fully capture. Islands, it turns out, have never been as permanent as we thought. We built our maps, our laws, our national boundaries, our concepts of sovereignty and territory on the assumption that the land would stay where it was. That the ground beneath our feet was solid and fixed and reliable. The disappearing islands are telling us something we perhaps should have known all along. Nothing is permanent. Not land. Not nations. Not the geography we inherit. The only question is how we respond when the things we assumed were fixed turn out to be fluid. The ocean was here before us. It will be here after us. The question is not whether it will take back the land it temporarily ceded to volcanic activity and coral growth and human habitation. The question is how many people we will allow it to displace along the way, and whether those people will have any say in the decisions that are sealing their fate. The island keeps disappearing. The question is what we plan to do about it.